Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the BuzzStream podcast. I'm your host, Vince Nero, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Jade Denby and Sam Forrester. Both work at Marketing Signals. Jade's the head of digital PR. Sam is the acting content manager. But they have a interesting counterpoint here that we're going to be talking about today, because Sam actually comes from a journalism background. He worked a long time at Reach PLC, NewsQuest, but Jade spent over 15 years on the agency side. So what I wanted to kind of talk about today was just what can digital PR professionals learn from journalists like Sam, who, have this deep background on how newsrooms work and how stories get picked up and whatnot. And then maybe vice versa. Like, I think there's a lot that journalists can really understand from digital PR professionals and how this whole thing works. And I think we could all play nicely together. So before we get into this, I just want to remind everybody to like and subscribe. The more that you share this stuff with your colleagues and interact with it, the more I can have great guests on like Jade and Sam. Second, quick reminders to check out List IQ, our AI-powered media list builder that helps you build lists right from Google News. And it streamlines a lot of the information collection process that typically takes a long time. It can help you build really great, hyper-relevant lists and target the right journalists in a fraction of the time that usually takes, which is hopefully something we'll get into a little bit here. But yeah, that's it for my spiel. Welcome, Sam and Jade. How you doing?
Yeah,
Good,
really
thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
really
excited
good.
to be
Happy
here.
to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. I know this is kind of an interesting, forum, that this three-person setup here, but like I said, I think this is a very important conversation to have. And you two are at a unique, you work at Marketing Signals. Jade, you reached out to me because you were like, hey, I've been doing this for a long time, and like reaching out to Reach PLC, it's such a big piece of the UK market. And when I joined Marketing Signals, I realized Sam had worked there for a long time, and it was a great opportunity for us to just all talk about this. So let's start quickly. Jade, can you just give people a sense of what your role is? And then Sam, I want you to tell what your role is as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the head of digital PR. I run a team at the moment of around 4 PRs. We have a very kind of a 50-50 split of clients across the UK and US at the moment. And then there's some with more remit for different markets, more global. But yeah, we do kind of all, I guess, the full range of digital PR, really. We do a bit of media monitoring, reactive, proactive, newsjacking, hero campaigns. We do bespoke strategies based on the client's kind of needs at the time. And I guess at more of a top level, I just help to make sure the team's happy, make sure that all the strategies are in place, that clients feel well serviced, and yeah, just look across everything from the top.
And Jade, are you in much of the day-to-day pitching these days? Or are you
Not
out of
some
the
of-
muck these days?
Only recently, I will say, only in the
Yes.
last kind of 2 to 3 years of 15 years. I think kind of you just naturally reach a point where your skill set sits more along kind of client servicing, kind of making sure that clients are happy and retained, and that, there's so much to keep up with in digital PR at the moment. We have to be upskilling kind of everything we do across tools, AI, what we're kind of activating and why. Every PR will know there's not that much thinking space in a day when you're on full delivery. So at the moment I'm sitting above. I'm always happy to muck in, but no, my team are amazing and do pretty much the majority of that.
Awesome. And then Sam, yeah, just give people a little sense of, and also maybe if you can give a sense of what you did before as well, Reach PLC and NewsQuest.
Yeah, of course. So at the moment, I'm the acting head of content at Marketing Signals. I'm on maternity cover for a friend of mine who was in the role before. I'm responsible for all of the content, really, sort of everything from creating the outlines to editing the copy. I have one full-time writer on my team, but we also outsource some of the content to freelancers. So I have a freelance writer list to manage and do all sorts, really. It sort of serves that aim, sort of link inserts, not just new content, but optimizing existing client content for SEO. Basically the buck stops with me for all content deliverables at marketing agency while I'm here. Prior to that, as you mentioned, I was at Reach PLC for over 15 years, I think it was. It's been bought out so many times. I worked under the same news brand, when it's Trinity Mirror, Local World, Northcliffe Media. I've been there since late 2007. I started when I was 19. And I've kind of almost done every role since I joined. I joined when it was it was very print led. We didn't have a website when I started. I was a junior reporter straight out of college. Didn't go to university or anything, so I kind of lucked into that one. I did a bit of work experience there, and they liked me, so they kept me on. So I was a junior reporter, took my seniors exam, the NCTJ qualification, and became a senior. And then a few years after that, wanted a bit more, so went onto the news desk, and I was assistant news editor. And this was a what was called the Western Gazette. It's now turned into Somerset Live and all of the live titles throughout the Reach brand. I'll try not to waffle on too much. About the time I became assistant news editor, they were starting to bring in sort of digital publishing. So they took, online news much more seriously, which later lead to Newsroom 2.0, where everything was digital first. But I kind of saw the change from, literally writing to shapes on newsprint to doing what I did, which was essentially managing sort of a catalogue of websites for Reach PLC, and later, and very briefly, I've got to say, it was at NewsQuest as well. I wasn't at NewsQuest for very long before I made the switch to agency life.
So thank you both for that, because I think it helps kind of solidify the conversation a bit. I want to kind of start with something interesting here, and let's start with you, Sam, first. What would you say, having been on the other side now, what is something that digital PR professionals consistently misunderstand about how newsrooms work?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because this is when Jade and I first met. When Jade was new to the agency, we started to get talking about this, and she was shocked by some of the things I was saying, which I think the biggest one is that it's very KPI driven, more than you'd think, and more than it was when it was print only. Newsrooms are all about the KPIs. They have yearly, monthly, and in effect daily unique page view targets. So when I was at Somerset Live, and just to let the listeners know, that's where I spent most of my time within that. So it's Somerset Live, Bristol Live, and Gloucester Live, but mostly Somerset. We had a daily target of 250,000 unique page views, and on a monthly basis, that was about 8 million. And it's not that easy to achieve. And so I'll get into this a bit later, but it's digital PR is in a really good position to kind of appeal to journalists, because essentially you're helping newsrooms achieve these targets. There's been a few sort of rounds of redundancies at Reach PLC over the past few years. There was two almost immediately after I left to go to NewsQuest. And these newsrooms are sort of on a bit of a shoestring. When I was there, there was me and 3 other news editors. We had 11 or 12 reporters. I think we had a sports guy, editors that sat above us. It was really busy. And that was right after COVID as well. So while it was all remote, it still felt busy. And I think it's been decimated since then. And it was a challenge when we had all those people to achieve, 250,000 unique page views a day. I'm not there now anymore, obviously, but it's even more difficult for them to achieve these targets. And there's a huge window there, I think, for digital PR to essentially help out. You're looking as a news editor for stories that are going to help you reach a really lofty page view target, and they need to be, interesting, appeal to the public. You need to almost be able to guarantee to your best judgment that will help you achieve that goal, because there's no point writing stories that nobody's going to read, right? It's, if they're not interesting, they just won't be shared. You're not going to be able to put them on, your Facebook channels, which is where the majority of the traffic for, these titles comes from. And yeah, I just think and Jade, when I spoke to her about it, before this podcast, was like a little bit shocked by that. And it's much more KPI driven than you think, I think, is the bottom line for me. It's all about achieving page views.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild. And I had kind of a similar moment. I spoke to someone. It was a Google event in New York City. I think it was Google Search Central event. And it was right when AI overviews were kind of really kicking off last year. And I spoke to someone who works at a lot of local news. I forget the main media company here in the States, but he was saying how much, just Google Discover itself was hurting their newsrooms. And it was like, yeah, they have they have goals too. They have KPI, and how he had to pivot into certain types of content that would really drive the new. And it was something like, I forget the term, like car crashes and whatever, like some stuff that really drives views,
Yeah.
it tends to be kind of more of the morbid stuff, like crashes and shootings or something like that, is like where they had to kind of pivot into, and you get away from like the fluffy feel good stories
Yeah.
almost, because
Yeah.
they don't get as much. But so Jade, tell me from your perspective then, how, I mean, what does that do to change the strategy for you? Like ideation, how do you talk
Yeah.
about the stuff with the clients?
I think it adds another layer for a PR in a sense that obviously doing it for so long, your focus was always the strength of the story. This needs to be such a editorially strong story with sound methodology, with real thinking. When I first started in digital PR and I was doing a lot of the data storytelling, journalists would say, I quite like this story, but what's the cause and what's the correlation? That was the
Hmm.
theme for a long time. It's like, you've got some great data, but tell me like the cause, the correlation, why this matters. You really had to sell in such a big picture as to why your story had any kind of importance. Because I think back then newsrooms were more about the story. And I
Yeah.
think it just shows the shift culturally that, yeah, we kind of, I've learned as I've gone, they've gone from probably, writing 5 really kind of sound stories a day to like sheer volumes of stories a day. And I think whilst we always think story first, we think story and we think client and how the two balance. I do still think that the prospects where we send it to, because we work across more volume than a traditional PR would, I think that feels like the last step. And we're trying to shoehorn a story sometimes. And we talk a lot about, we've got your main story, but let's personalize the pitch to the journalist each time. But we're still really working with one story and we're just trying to make it fit. I think time is always against all of us, journalists, PRs. I think maybe to Sam's point, we need to go more to social media now. Read the headlines on social media, and probably do we overcomplicate things sometimes in data storytelling? We need to get back to human interest stories. One thing that I love that me and my colleagues talk about all the time is, does it pass the pub test? And I still think that rings true today. If you
Yeah.
read a headline and it sparks a conversation in a pub. And so sometimes we can get lost in, I think, hero campaigns, especially where we go, we've got this great data, 10 different data points, we've scored it, we've indexed it, we've applied it to XYZ. But if you still can't explain it in a punchy one-liner, you've just overcomplicated. I think sometimes we overcomplicate it for ourselves. And in a way, is it coming back to, we've seen a trend a little bit since COVID already, more reactive, quicker storytelling, more stories more often to meet the beat of journalists. But I think sometimes we get stuck in plans and ways of working, like we'll do X amount of kind of activations for you this quarter or in this scope. And we get a bit scared. And so we put all our eggs into one basket. One story must work multiple ways. Actually, do we just need multiple stories with more simple executions and more simple points that land? I think we have to change our thinking a little bit and become as agile as journalists now have to be. And I think it has been eye-opening to think that they are under pressure like we are. It always felt like we were the ones a little bit under pressure at the mercy of journalists. But I think journalists are at the mercy of their bosses now and their audiences. People demand stories on social media. The comments can be brutal. They've
Yeah.
got page views to hit as we've got coverage numbers and links targets to hit. So I think something that Sam and I spoke about earlier is how when I first started, journalists were quite scary to me. Maybe that was a youth thing. Maybe that's the way journalism was back then. And every time I ask a question to Sam, he says, "Oh, I wouldn't have minded that as a journalist, or I would have been okay with that request." And I think, oh, maybe journalists are just people too. They're not as scary as it's kind of an us and them kind of feel sometimes. But in actual fact, yeah, we're all trying to do the same thing, and we should be trying to help each other. I think the lack of communication sometimes due to busyness just means we're doing a lot of guesswork, and we're maybe getting to that guesswork a little bit too late.
It does depend when you have that experience as well, because I will say when I first came into a newsroom, literally as a teenager, it was
Mm.
very scary. And maybe it's the benefit of hindsight, but the people did seem harsher back then. It was a bit more like, not cutthroat, that's too harsh, but they didn't really suffer fools. You know what I mean? Not that they do now, but it was a bit of a harsher newsroom. And it's and one thing I wanted to pick up on there, Jane, you've said it, like the pub test is still
Mm.
definitely the way to go. Like if you had a story, say about like a police being called to a drug den or something. You wouldn't go like, police were called today at this time on this road for this. You've kind of not got to the point, but it's like, there was a drugs raid on this street today. That's much more like, that's what you would say to somebody else. And just to sort of pick up on another thing you said, one thing that Newsroom 2.0 did was allow editors and reporters to know which stories worked and which didn't. Because you would have, when it was print, everything would be packaged together and you'd be judged by circulation figures. And sometimes, I had an experience where I wrote a really good front page story and I looked at the circulation figures a few weeks later and I was like, oh, that actually made a dent. Like that, we were up 3% that week. And somebody would tell me, oh, yeah, but that was the same time we had that offer on, free sausage roll for every reader from Greg's. And so you wouldn't know if like it was your story or that offer or a combination of both. And much less would you know the individual impact that each story in your, back then quite a thick newspaper would actually have. That completely changed now to the point where every single story you do will have a unique page views next to it. News editors I guarantee you, sit with some software open like Chartbeat or Omniture, constantly looking at the amount of concurrent visitors on their websites. And, it only takes one story. So, a reporter will pitch you a story, you think, okay, yeah, that sounds okay. You'll publish it, you'll share it on social media, and it might get a few hundred that day. And it's like, no, that kind of story just doesn't work. And you've just got that instant, we know what works and what doesn't now in a way that wasn't there before, which I always found really interesting. And it was sort of a double-edged sword, really, because I think you alluded to this, Vince, before we started recording, was that these nice community stories sat really well in newspapers, but in the cold light of day, when you were trying to like get page views out of them, nobody really cared. And it's that part of journalism is kind of going away for better or worse, but it's ultimately comes down to what people want to read.
Yeah.
I think PRs would kill to know about that piece of software and in real time what's working and what's not, because I think we still probably assume that you guys work to editorial planned calendars for the most part, and that everything else that lands in your inbox just gets picked up because the headline piqued your interest enough.
Yeah.
But it again shows that you're quite data driven in your approach, the same way that digital PRs have to be in their approach. I find that really interesting. And I think when Sam had mentioned to me kind of the software to track topics, what's performing, how something that doesn't do so well on day one might get moved down the homepage, like that's a high pressure kind of data environment that I think that we can kind of relate to. So I found that super interesting.
Yeah, Sam, I mean, that's a good segue into one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is just to illuminate for listeners and viewers of just what a day in the life looks like. I mean, you've spelled out some of this, but like as an editor at a news station, newsroom, what does it look like?
Yeah. So in my experience at the time, like I said, we had a few news editors kicking around the newsroom, and the typical day would look, so we'd have like an early, a mid and a late shift. So it would run from, 6 in the morning until 10 at night, with each of us overlapping and somebody taking, the 6 till 2 shift, the 9 to 5 and the 2 till 10 PM shift. So the first person that gets in is basically going to come in and look at the like Chartbeat or Omniture, see how the site is performing so far. There would be some content that we'd done the day before, possibly planned to go live the next day. Pick up any breaking news, as we sort of again talked about just before we started recording. That's a huge driver of traffic, and it sounds really morbid, but sometimes if you saw that there'd been a bit of a crash on the M5 or something, you'd almost be like, oh, good, because that's a live blog on that.
Right.
It sounds awful, but it's like that's going to get us off to a really good start today. And you'd cover all the breaking news, pick up the file logs overnight, see any emergency services story, check the inboxes, do your normal thing, start to plan the day. We'd normally schedule a homepage refresh the night before, so that as soon as midnight ticks over, you'd have a fresh homepage, and that would get refreshed throughout the day. One thing that Jade was quite surprised to learn was that we have news conferences every morning. No, it wasn't just kind of like a weekly thing. It was like, okay, what's going on today? My team back then, like I say, it was sort of 9, 10, 11 reporters. Get them all on a call, and then sort of call them individually and say, essentially they pitch to me. There's a real similarity there between digital PR and actual reporters, and it's advice I'm going to give a bit later. It's like the reporters I had would pitch to me in much the same way that anybody with a press release or a campaign would in my inbox, because they'd come and say, oh, I've got this story, and I'd sort of look at a story by story basis and say, like, on average, we're going to need each story we write today. Reporters have only got enough time to maybe write 3 or 4. with our page view target, it's got to be about 5,000 each. You've got to, it's got to be good. It's got to be shareable. So I'd call all of them and say, and they come with stories and I say, oh, okay, well, maybe that would work. I actually really like the sound of that. Some I think actually maybe not. Like, don't do that story because it's just, it passes muster. It's worthy, but like it might be in a town that doesn't have a particularly big Facebook group, where you can't share it. It's all these kind of things go into considerations. A large part of that, you would plan the day in terms of what the reporters had pitched you, but it was very reactive at the same time. We did plan ahead for certain big events, things we knew that were coming, but it was very much day to day, more than you might think. So yeah, that would happen. They'd go away, make their calls, write their stories, and my day from that point on would be sort of editing what they came back with, which can take a bit of time because some stories, they might be legally contentious or, whatever the case may be. And then the one thing we scheduled the most was the social media. So, they pitch their stories, and between that time and them actually writing them, we'd say, okay, we're at 3 p.m. If, Emma has turned around this story on on time, that's going to be our 3 p.m. post. And it was kind of be scheduling the social media content for that day. And yeah, just kind of reacting as you come in, because you might get to 12 and you think, okay, we're in a really good spot here. We've already got 100,000 concurrent views today. We need 250. Other days it would be, oh my God, we've only got 50 or 40. Like, we need to do a lot more today if we're going to keep up with the pace that this monthly page view target demands. And then amongst that, there's, a bit of weekend planning. You're looking at sort of timeless stories. Somebody might pitch a story to you that day and be like, actually, can we save that for Saturday? Because people might are more inclined to read that, if it's an event going on or something like that. General managerial responsibilities, you have one-to-ones with these guys. In my experience, most of the reporters, certainly at a local news level, are trainees, many brand new. And that's another thing that I think might surprise people, is that a lot of these are very, very young, very capable people, very intelligent people, but for a lot of them, it's their first job. So they're coming in, they're learning from you. You're sort of managing them as well. There's occasionally some disciplinary stuff, although I'm happy to say I didn't encounter too much of that during my tenure at all. But a lot of it's mentoring as well. Telling them why you've said, I don't like this story, and this is why, because it's not going to, or I really like this because you do this with it, and you can follow up with that. Yeah. And then, dealing with the occasional complaint and answering to your bosses as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying all this stuff, my mind's going a mile a minute thinking of like ways that you can be more strategic, that digital PRs can be more strategic about how they pitch. But also, I'm like, to the point that you made, Jade, it's like at some point you can get too strategic and you lose some of the thread. So can you talk me through kind of how you've reconciled some of this stuff that you're learning from Sam and how that's maybe impacted your strategy as a digital PR?
I think to look social first, maybe. I mean, I know that we're all moving towards a kind of social news feed, but I think especially when we talk about Sam's experience in regional, so Reach PLC is these beloved Facebook groups. So when Sam said the size of the Facebook group, not necessarily the Somerset Live Facebook group, but general Somerset. And, as somebody in my little kind of city, I am on those kinds of Facebook groups and talking to people and engaging in those. And I think that has made me think, well, maybe we should start more Facebook kind of grassroots research to see what gets engaged with, what people comment on. And then can we take that and make it work for a client? Because I think we still have to remember that a lot of clients like to be super brand safe and positive. And we know from experience that the best titles that are going to spark a pub conversation can be slightly divisive, right? You pit older drivers against younger drivers, or you kind of say something a little bit more controversial. Some brands that I work with don't even want to say that something's the worst. They'll only say that these are the best places and they won't touch the worst places. You'll have clients that are a better fit for that kind of thing. And I think it's more to do with strategy and activation. If a client can be that agile, if they can be more social first headlines, things that really engage people on an everyday level, then I think that strategy will work for you. But I think we always have to remember that there's a layer of like really blue chip corporate clients that are just never going to fit that model. And you have to find ways of making digital PR work for them too. It's possible. It's just more of a long game. It's a little bit trickier. But I think, yeah, speaking to Sam, I was like, it's interesting that they have KPIs. It's interesting that they are trend led, because we're going more trend led, kind of. It used to be about checking a set amount of news sites in the morning, but now I check TikTok creator insights and Pinterest predict reports. And I think social first from an ideation standpoint and being a little bit more human in how we storytell as opposed to data led, because I think we can all be a bit guilty of leading with a percentage of the population, da 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 da, which feels maybe a little bit cold. Kind of just humanize and lighten up our stories a little bit if the brand allows. I think that's a really interesting space to go into for 2026 because I do think digital PR and what works and how we should approach it does change every 1 to 2 years. You can't just keep reusing the same strategies and the same
Yeah.
tactics. You have to refresh. But at the minute, I think a social first lens is a good starting point for any sparking ideas, and then reverse engineer it maybe to your client and what works for them.
Yeah. And journalism has changed so much as well. Just to give you an example, some of the biggest stories that we would do and, would be things like it was when Nando's opened in Yeovil, that was huge. That was like it got thousands and thousands of, clicks because people were really excited to read that. When's it going to open? Where's it going to go? That kind of thing. When I was coming up in print, you would not do that story. That's advertising. You just wouldn't do it. If you pitch that to a news editor, they go like, no, they can pay for an advert. Whereas now it's much more, it's so much more audience led than I think it ever was. I always feel like when I was in print, we were sort of almost like not dictating to people, but like, this is the news because like, this is what we found and this is what's going on. Whereas now, like I say, there's some very, what would be historically considered like journalistically relevant stories that you may not do because it's not going to do as well as, Nando's opening in Yeovil, for example, or, KFC or whatever. Like there's much more room for that kind of audience led stuff.
Yeah. And one thing I'm picking out from what both of you are saying is this idea of it's not like a one size fits all. I mean, definitely not from like a strategic point of view, right? Like it's maybe getting a little tougher to templatize the deliverables, but also when it comes to specifically like pitch templates and stories that fit specific outlets. Like it sounds like and this is something I talk about all the time, but like this idea of like hyper relevancy, and it sounds like it would benefit at digital PR, strategists to really dig into the, potential outlets ahead of time. Like when you're crafting a strategy, it's not, let me see how many links I can get from this one story. It's how many stories can I create that will be, helpful for these specific outlets, right? So you're thinking outlet specific rather than story. I mean, does that sound like it's doable though? Like that sounds like it's totally flipping the script, right? You're relying on fewer links to move the needle for your clients, right?
Yeah. I think one thing that digital PR probably doesn't get given enough time for is just general research. Because unlike certain teams, our whole fee is us, it's our time. And digital PR is so time intensive. And so it looks quite pricey on a page, really, compared to a lot of other kind of marketing channels where a client, that they might be taking a commission on a media buy or something like that, but we're pure time. And so what we tend to do is we cut out anything that's not kind of really easy to explain as like, this is how we do the do, and then we activate, and then we do the outreach, and this is your hours in a nice little bow per campaign. And I think as somebody who's kind of leading PR teams now, that's the biggest battle that I always have internally is kind of give us time to do this research, because I think people forget, unlike more traditional PR, they spend more time in a client sector. Our client sectors and client base can change so regularly that by the time you've dug into the weeds and figured out the formula, they might be gone again, and then you're on to the next one. So I always think the beauty is in the time. If we had the time to do a lot of research up front, I'm talking kind of news research, is probably where we fall down. And again, I think that's where we try to reverse engineer it at the end. We say, well, we've got to get something off the ground. We have to have these meetings. We have to get PR activations underway. We have to make it align with the brand. We have to make sure we hit key trends and that it feels seasonal and tactical. And we go, great. And then we get there and we go, Now we've got to make it work for the masses without coming across as too fake and over personalizing to journalists as well. So, yeah, I think if we were allowed more time to do the kinds of things that come out in conferences when you go and hear people talk, or the kind of tidbits that you get from ex-journalists about the things that they'd like to see, it's not so much that we don't want to do that. It's just so much that it's hard to justify a crazy amount more time spent on that doesn't kind of tie as closely into a direct result for a client. So I think some of it comes back to strategy. I think it comes back to educating clients. I think it comes back to budgeting and not underselling our hours, because
Right.
underselling of hours leads to a lot of pressure. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I want to switch a little bit here because I know Reach PLC right now is under a lot of heat for the fake experts and these issues that are. I think it's bleeding a little bit into the U.S. It seems very UK based right now in terms of the coverage that I'm seeing. But how can people, Sam, based off of your inner workings of this, like, what are you learning from this situation? How, what tips are you giving Jade about like how digital PRs can leverage, some of this inside knowledge that you have?
When it comes to sort of fake experts,
Yeah, kind of navigating through this realm, because I think the feedback that I'm seeing from a lot of journalists I talk to is they don't trust it. It's tough to trust any of the expertise you're given. And I know that is such a big piece of, especially in the UK, it's just such a big piece of, responding to journal requests and the Haro and all that kind of communication. It just seems like a big hurdle and a pain point in the industry. So I'm just kind of curious, based off of what you know about how journalists work through this and verify their sources, what can digital PRs do maybe to get ahead of this?
yeah, I think it all comes down to angles, really. Like a good journalist is going to recognize a good story, do you know? So, um, it's a tricky one because what's going on now with like the fake experts has kind of happened after I left. But would always say that the strength of a digital PR campaign or outreach would get past the noise. And
Hmm.
I think as long as digital PR experts almost like stick to their guns, like, there's some really, really, really good people in this industry that know what they're doing and they know what a good story is, even if they don't have experience directly in a newsroom. It's being true to that and kind of making sure that what they're offering is the best it can be. To pick up on what Jay said before as well about like sort of how much work do you put in at that stage, how much do you localize this, the outreach that you're doing. There was a campaign, I'm not sure if it's still going within Reach, where there was a real focus for a couple of years on hyperlocal stuff. And we were talking a bit before we got on the podcast about kind of the types of stories and remembering that journalists will do some of that legwork for you. So, for example, if you had a story about, national education figures, and let's just say that these figures showed that attendance rates at schools had fallen by 20% since COVID, you could break that down by region. The journalist, like a good journalist and a good news editor, will recognize that we can take that and build off of it and use the information that you have got on sort of a national level to then go and interview a local head teacher about it. And suddenly that story becomes very relevant to your audience. You go talk to the head teacher of the biggest school in your town, you get a picture with him, you use the statistics from this story to, as the baseline for it, but the angle becomes what this head teacher thinks of it. And, say that, I keep using Yeovil as an example, but that's where I live. So I'm just going to go with it. Say that head teacher goes, actually, yeah, at this school, we have noticed that and it's a real problem. And, suddenly you've got this real local take on a national issue that becomes like a really good story. You can share that on Facebook. You've got a picture of the head teacher outside the school. It's every parent in that town is going to go like, oh, what's going on here? And it immediately becomes appealing to that audience, in a way that perhaps the pure statistics wouldn't before. So there's an element of, digital PR, like I say, sticking to their guns and knowing what is good and what isn't. Nobody in a digital PR agency is going to interview, I don't know how many head teachers in every region of the UK just to get, 76 different localized versions of that story, that is an enormous amount of work that, like, frankly, you shouldn't need to do, because you can do that story once, give a little sort of, in Manchester, it's this percent, in London, it's this percent, in Birmingham, it's this percent, and then send that to the newsrooms, and they should pick up on the fact that these are really shocking figures. We should localize this. So part of it is like remembering that the journalist, should do some of the work. That's what they're judged on. That's how they make it a story that's worth reporting and then becomes shareable, rather than, every Reach title in the UK doing the same data-led story, which, while worthy, if it's just, I can't remember how many titles Reach PLC has exactly, but it's quite a few. If you just see the same story everywhere, it just won't work. It might do something, but it's not the same as, why does this matter to people in Birmingham? Why does this matter to people in Manchester? That kind of thing.
Well, let me flip it, because I think the feedback that digital PR teams have gotten is journalists are so time poor that, you should be including experts into your, expert quotes and trying to get those case studies for journalists, because it takes that off their plate. And I think people are running with it, and, you end up building off entire strategy off of that pain point, where it's, I'm going to comment on everything that's going on and try to insert my brand into everything. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is, like, it needs to be, it benefits you to be as localized as possible. So, like, your random brand is not going to be an expert. If you're you own a review site, or, reviews headphones or something, you don't need to comment on what's going on in, Yorkshire or something. Like, there is a element of this that still needs to be authentic to the pieces that you're reaching out to.
You're absolutely right. Journalists are, pretty time poor. Like I said, it's very reactive. In my experience, there wasn't too much time to plan that far ahead. And like I say, because of the sort of redundancies and generally how much smaller news teams are now, it's even more important because they sort of have even less time. But I would say as well, like, just to come back to my original point, was that it's still something they should be doing. And it doesn't take that much time and effort for, a journalist to kind of reach out to a local contact, or, whatever the story might be, to localize it themselves. And it's a lot easier, I think, for, let's say that, one or two people in a digital PR agency, they can't ring X amount of head teachers across the country. That's not a good use of their time. However, a reporter in each one of those cities can and should, in order to get that and make it localized and make it appeal to their audience as much as possible. So there's the work is done on the other side, and as it should be.
Jade, do you find yourself still being able to utilize the, like, expert commentary strategy, even in light of all the fake expert stuff that's going on?
Yeah. I think, I guess, coming back to strategy, like, if you have, since COVID, relied pretty heavily on media monitoring, product gifting, expert commentary for your clients, you might feel slightly panicked with what's been going on. And I think this is, for me, always comes back to not too many eggs in one basket. But I think, for me, every time in the last few years that a big thing, a big update happens, it always just gives me a sigh of relief. Like, because it always just comes back to SEO for me, and it always helps strengthen eat factors that we've been telling clients in a more technical way to do for a long time. And it's not until we can explain it in more of a PR way, I don't find it goes in. So I can't tell you how many CO meetings I've been in with clients where there's been kind of full strategy reviews, and we've said, authorship in your sector is really important. Competitors are doing it. Update the blog, spotlight some experts that you can attribute to content time and time again. Build that profile. Search engines love it. It's going to help you rank. Tumbleweed. It's one of those things on an SEO strategy that never gets actioned. But then you add in this layer of, well, journalists are crying out for experts now, but there's so many fake ones that there's a bit of scaremongering. So we just need to make it super easy for them to identify you as an expert. That could start with your website, right? We could have digital profile like on there. You could have an authorship, you can vet them here, here, and here. And we just make that so much simpler. I think the onus has been on the journalists to do that till now. And now we can just, again, add that layer of ease in for a journalist, while at the same time reinforcing to clients, authors and experts aren't going anywhere. They're important for PR and they're important for SEO. And a lot of what I think's changing is just bringing it all together. Some things felt like they were kind of recommended and felt quite technical SEO. But now I feel like for the first time, like the whole SEO picture's merging together quite nicely for PR. So I think for me, whilst it's a little bit kind of an unsettled time, I think if you're doing all the right things, there's no reason that, anyone should blacklist your agency. Yes, your experts might not have that kind of digital footprint at the moment, so you just need to work a little bit harder to explain that to a journalist. They're in a very niche industry. They haven't spoken up much previously. However, they are experienced to talk to you on this because of X, Y, Z. Just give them all of that upfront so that the journalist doesn't have to question anything or see another Google Drive link from another PR, which just immediately makes more sense, So for me, I think all good for SEO in the long term.
Yeah, I love that. And this was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Sam, at the onset. It's maybe good full circle, is this idea of, if you're looking for traffic, right? If the KPI for newsrooms is traffic, how much does SEO play into that? Do newsrooms understand it? Do they understand keyword-driven articles? And is that something that digital PR teams can and should lean more heavily into?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that digital PR professionals can capitalize on, because I had the benefit of going from a newsroom, which we tried to do SEO. It was slightly different, which I'll touch on in a minute, to an actual dedicated SEO agency before I worked at Marketing Signals, which offers a few more things in addition to SEO. And I learned an awful lot. And I learned an awful lot of what newsrooms were doing wrong. It was, there was no keyword research as far as I could tell. Certainly not any that was passed down to on a newsroom level. There was a central team that wrote articles that were kind of for trending SEO. So, I think if you go on any Reach site, if they still do this around the time of, anything like Strictly Come Dancing or something like that, they will all have articles about Strictly Come Dancing. And it might work for the Mirror and it might work for Manchester Evening News and the bigger titles, but it will not really work for you. And all it does is kind of drag the rest down, because you've got the same article that you might have reworded the intro of, but essentially it's like we said before about those other stories, it's the same article across all of these news sites. When I was there, we certainly didn't do any keyword research. We kind of tried, and we got lucky with a few things. One of the biggest SEO successes that I had at Somerset Live was when there was a show on Channel 5 called Sarah Beanie's New Life in the Country. And she was a TV presenter, and and there was a local link because she bought this property, this big fixer-upper in Bruton, which is in Somerset. So there's a local link there. We wrote a few articles just because there was a local link. We weren't planning to do it for any SEO reason. Because it wasn't the biggest show and because it was on Channel 5, for a few months, we were the only people writing about Sarah Beanie's New Life in the Country. And when it was on TV, people were Googling Sarah Beanie, and we did really well out of that. What happened was some of the bigger titles said, oh, look at how well Somerset Live is doing with Sarah Beanie's New Life in the Country. They would do their own articles and they would outrank us because, the domain rating of the Manchester Evening News is leagues higher than Somerset Live. To Jay's point, that kind of happened by accident. We didn't plan to do that because it was like, this will be really good for SEO. And I know for a fact that nobody else is going to cover this, and we'll be the only ones reporting on, Sarah Beanie and what she's doing in Bruton. We wrote it to share on Facebook, and the fact that it's getting traffic through search is great. And, we tried our best to kind of do other stories, about Sarah Beanie. I think we did one about what's her net worth, and, we did a story with a lady that wasn't happy. She was one of the objectors to Sarah's planning application at the time, and those all did really well. But there was at local level, there was no real SEO strategy that, we tried, but knowing now what I know about SEO, now I know how to actually do keyword research. I tell, former journalist colleagues of mine, if I had my time again, if I knew what I know about SEO now, then I think we could have done an awful lot better. Capitalizing on some of it, because there's so many, easy wins, quick wins, very, Somerset keywords, you've got things that people search for all the time, Stonehenge, all these things that you could just do a little informational post all about it and you could rank that. But then, we also didn't really know about, again, they might have known this at sort of the central level, the higher up level, but we didn't know an awful lot about link building. We knew it was good if people linked to you, but we didn't quite know. We didn't do outreach. Nobody had the time to kind of do that, and we didn't even know about it anyway. What Jade was saying about sort of getting SEO-led stories into newsrooms, I think is a huge, potential win. Like, unless it's changed dramatically since I left, and everyone's a lot more clued up now about SEO. It's
Yeah,
something
so I
that
mean,
they're not doing, and digital PR could do for them.
so like for Jade, for you, is that just a matter of kind of figuring out how to package this so that it doesn't seem like how overt can you be? Like some of the best performing stories that I've seen when I talk to customers and stuff is, or that I have done myself, is like it has some timely aspect to it, so you can lean on like, hey, this thing is trending, and typically, if it is trending and it's really trending nationwide, like it's going to have search volume, or locally it might have some search volume. So like, is that kind of the way you are achieving this without overtly saying like, hey, this is a keyword? Because I feel like that could easily turn a journalist off if they're like, I don't understand this or care about SEO. But if you're like, this is
Yeah.
a trending thing, it's up 1,000% or whatever, then maybe the lights turn on, and it's like, hey,
Yeah.
this will bring in traffic.
I think weirdly when I'm pitching in the story, I'm not thinking about the SEO. I'm just treating it like I need to pitch a story to a journalist and I need to meet them in that vein. We do obviously a lot of back end keyword research, and we create landing pages and we optimize where the traffic's going to land. And that's kind of where I think digital PRs wear those two hats. It's kind of being more traditional PR when we're doing that part of the role, but also having to be technical SEO when we're compiling campaign landing pages, or when we're thinking about where to drive links to have maximum impact and value. It's very interesting what Sam said about the SEO and the trending writers across the regionals, because that was a bit of a sigh of relief for me as a digital PR, because I felt like they've always kind of known, because we're these people that pop up with stories which I still think are very different to other PR teams and stories I've seen. So they must have suspected. And then we're constantly asking for links. Like, they must be like, okay, I've just posted your story. What are you asking me for now? So you can see the knowledge building over time. And I found that when I was pitching quite data-led stories into SEO kind of journalists or trending news journalists, they took it straight away. It was just kind of like an unspoken rule of, we know that this is more data backed and about the trends and about what people are actually talking about right now, because you're giving me a wealth of data from TikTok or social media or a well-known data set or whatever it might be. And I feel like that kind of bridged the gap for us, where there was this kind of unspoken conversation of, there's still a strong story there and they want it for that reason, but they're accepting of data because it's a data story. And it was like journalists had upskilled in that area, and
Mhm.
I loved it. So like when Great British Bake Off was on, and I could constantly pitch, my baking clients recipes, expert chef tips. Here's what, not to do when you bake those jammy dodgers, or whatever was on the show the night before. That was just such a successful run for the entire length of the show, because we sent in the expert tips, but we backed it with search data.
Mhm.
Kind of like a
Mhm.
two-pronged approach. So it can have a real nice sweet spot. I don't think we probably need to get too bogged down into the weeds, because like you say, something that would pass the pub test, that feels trendy, that anyone who is like on a phone, right, knows kind of what news is going on and what people are talking about and what's getting the most interaction. So I think it's kind of like, keep PR a little bit to more about trends, about what people would actually want to talk about, what you could explain to your mum or your friend that doesn't work in digital PR and SEO, and keep the
Mhm.
technical stuff to the website and to the strategy meetings with clients. And when you're selling in the big picture, it's kind of like a two-pronged approach for me. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, yeah, that does. I love that. All right. I don't want to keep you guys. I know you're both very busy. I want to thank you so much. I really wanted to ask if you still have arguments and disagree on certain aspects of this, seeing from both sides. But I feel like we should leave it on a positive note and talk about how we should all work together and not what we're disagreeing on. But maybe there's a part 2 where we can come on and you guys can, we can
Yeah.
air our grievances
Yeah.
about.
I think on a positive note that digital PRs and journalists have started to merge. Like, I see way more journalists speaking to us, sharing information, popping up at digital PR conferences. We probably need to start doing the same and hearing from more journalists and people that work in real newsrooms. And I feel like the last few years for me have broken down some of those barriers between us and them. It feels like it's going in the right direction. So I think we just
Yeah.
have to keep learning from each other, which sounds really cheesy, but
No, it's really good to see. And I would sort of add on to the end of that, and I've alluded to it, earlier on in the podcast, was that I think journalists need digital PR now more than ever, because if I could give anyone working in digital PR advice, it would be like, pretend you're a reporter for that paper and you're pitching a story or a campaign to a news editor as if you didn't work in digital PR, as if you were in that newsroom, because that's essentially what they'll be doing with what you send them. If you send a reporter, a campaign, or even if it's just a press release or a story or whatever, it has to pass muster with them, but they then have to pitch it to their news editor and go, like, I think this could do really well. And like I say, there's a much smaller group of people than they were trying to get, very lofty page view targets, and digital PR, is helping them with that. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why, if you've noticed the barriers starting to break down, Jay, that may be why, because, they're grateful for it. And if you can help them achieve, news websites have page view targets, but just as I was leaving, they were bringing in individual targets for reporters. So these reporters are really held to account by their bosses in terms of like, well, you haven't generated this many page views this month, or you're doing really well. Anything you can do to help them, they'll be your best friend. That, it's a really good time, just act like you're there to help them deliver their page views, and I don't think you'll go wrong.
Yeah, I love it. Where can people contact you if they want to learn more about this or learn more about what you're working on at Marketing Signals?
LinkedIn for me tends to be, I think, where the most of the digital PR community are these days. But yeah, definitely LinkedIn.
Yeah, same for me. If anybody, we could probably talk a lot longer about what we have done. But if anybody does, digital PR wants to kind of ask, me a question as a former journalist, I would love it. I'd do my best to answer, and just want to say that this has been really fun. It's been really eye-opening for me as well to learn a bit more about the digital PR side. So anything I can do to help continue to grow this relationship, this is getting very like politician answers. Anything I can help with this, like it's, I want to hear from people, and if they want to, have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Love it. Yeah. Well, so for listeners, viewers, if you do have questions, definitely pop them in the comments and make sure that, Jade or Sam get to this. So again, this is Jade Denby and Sam Forrester at Marketing Signals. You can check out Marketing Signals, just marketingsignals.com, right?
Yeah.
Check out all their work there. Like they said, check them out on LinkedIn, connect with them, ask your questions. Reminder, like, subscribe, and check out List IQ if you are interested in building those hyper-relevant media lists. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Jade. This was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Good luck out there.
Thank you.